Good morning. This is class number 3, textiles course in the interior design department. Today we're going to talk about yarns. It's a fun class where we're going to play with a few yarns, kind of dissect them, figure out what happens to all those fibers that we discussed last week. So you can't tell me something fun you did this week, so let me think of something fun that I did that I could share with you. Just been working really hard, so nothing particularly fun to share with you. Hopefully you've had a good week. I will give the opening prayer. Since you can't do it, I suppose you could, but I wouldn't see you. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this morning to be attending a class and for me to be teaching a class. We ask you to bless us, bless this class, that the students will be receptive to the things that I've prepared, that I will be able to prepare them in a manner that makes sense to them, that the students might have a better understanding of yarns and how that relates to fabric and how that in turn relates to becoming an interior designer. We thank thee for our blessings. Thankful for all that we have, and say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, so you worked in your swatch books last week, so hopefully you didn't have any time finding fiber content and yarn type. If you're still having trouble, if you've had any trouble with that, you can always email me and I will help you find those items to put in your swatch book. Remember, those things the assignments have to be done before the official class time so that you can get full credit for them. All right, this darling picture with kitties playing with yarn comes with all kinds of warnings online that you should never let your cat do this because they can get strangled, but it sure makes for an awfully cute image, doesn't it? So this little chart here shows us the progression of our class, where we've been, where we're going, so that you can understand the big picture of why we're talking about this in the order that we are. Of course, first we talked about the characteristics of fabric and sustainability and design, just as an introductory lecture. And then our second week we discussed fibers, all the different fibers that go into making up fabrics and making up yarn. We talked about natural fibers and manufactured fibers, and we'll review that chart in just a minute. Today we're going to talk about yarns, the linear material or the fibers that are made into fabric, how all those fibers that we learned about last week actually are twisted into yarns. Next week we'll talk about fabric structure, of course, how cloth is made, and then fabric design, how fabric looks with the different designs that are woven into it or printed on it. So there's a natural progression to the classes in this lecture. They kind of build on the previous class. That's why it's real important that you don't miss any classes. So let's look back and quickly review what we learned last week about fibers. We learned the difference between natural fibers and manufactured fibers. The natural fibers, of course, are broken down into the plant-based and the animal-based, the cellulosic and the protein. So we talked at length about that. We spent a little bit less time talking about the manufactured fibers, the regenerated, are the ones that come from natural materials, but they're regenerated into a manufactured fiber, and then also those that are completely synthetic. So hopefully you have a good basic understanding of those. So our objective today is to understand yarn. Okay, yarn is the linear material. It can either be spun or extruded that is used in fabric making. And yarn is a very inclusive term. It includes threads. It's anything that is made out of the fibers that's eventually going to be woven or knit into fabric. And this term yarn includes filament, thread, yarns of all type, anything at all that can be woven into fabric. So these are some of my threads and yarns in my studio in Newport Beach. I'm teaching from Salt Lake City today. But these are some of my threads and yarns that have been made from the fibers that we talked about at length last week. So what is yarn? It's a continuous strand of textile fibers, the fibers that we have learned about, in a form suitable for fabrication. In other words, a form that is suitable to be made into fabric. So we start with fibers. I'm kind of beating this dead horse, right? But I want you to really understand that we start with fibers that are made into yarns that are made into fabrics. So we'll get an understanding today of how that yarn is made, what you want to happen with your yarns. So on that twist step, you have to get it just right. If it's too much, then it tangles like a phone cord. If it's twisted too little, the strands are weak and separated. So you just, they have to make sure that that twist is exactly right. The next step is finishing. And they said the secret ingredient right here is the steaming. It gives it the fullness that it needs. Then we have ball winding by weight. And he talked about the ones that where the yarn actually breaks during the process are pulled off and they're sold as second quality or mill ends, which is an interesting concept. I used to shop at a place in Santa Monica that sold fabric and yarns that were all seconds. They were all mill ends. They all had something that was damaged on them so that they couldn't be sold at full price. And I loved shopping there because I could rarely find what the flaw was in the yarn or the fabric. It was so minor, but they couldn't sell it for full price because it had some sort of a flaw in it. So, it was a good opportunity to get some good prices, actually. Bagging is almost too obvious to report on. He mentioned that sometimes the yarn is bagged by hand, sometimes it's automated. There are machines that bag it for them or that can do the work for them. And of course, the secret ingredient that we mentioned was what? That was steam that makes the yarn kind of puff up into that look that they wanted in this particular factory. Okay, so filament yarn properties. Oh, this slide's a little bit out of whack. It's not, it didn't translate from Google Slides into PowerPoint the way that I wanted to, so I apologize for the look of this one. But we have filament yarn and spun yarn. Filament yarn on the left and spun yarn. And the word spun its way almost off the chart. So we are going to first talk about filament yarns, and then we'll come back to spun yarns. So the filament yarns are the long, continuous ones. They can, like silk. Remember the silk that came out of that cocoon that we saw last week would give you 1,000 yards in one long, continuous line. Or it can be manufactured to become a filament line. The process is actually somewhat similar. You start with a liquid that has to be extruded out of some sort of a really small hole, and then this liquid comes out and eventually dries and makes a filament. That's what happens to silk, and that's what happens to manufactured filament. It can be monofilament, meaning just one line. It can be metallic. It can be multi-filament with several pieces of filament to get put together. Examples of that would be silk and nylon fishing line. I've got a few pictures that show that. Monofilament nylon was originally created for the fibers on toothbrushes. Those are just a collection of a bunch of pieces of nylon filament. You can actually feel that on your toothbrush. You can look at the individual filaments there. To get this wonderful picture of that fishing line there, and I'm holding it right here. You might be able to see it in the picture on the left. I was in Newport Beach on Balboa Island, and I ran around the island until I could find some fisherman that would give me a piece of his fishing line so that I wouldn't have to go buy any that day. So I found two young boys that were very happy to give me a piece of their monofilament fishing line. And you'll see why I wanted fishing line in the next slide. Okay, so we have monofilament. We have a picture of some metallic filament lines. Okay, so now let's talk about spun yarns. We've talked about monofilament lines, but now we'll talk about spun yarns that are made from natural or man-made fibers, where it's actually spun together, okay? So spinning makes them substantially stronger. What I did, I pulled yarns, as you can see in this picture, from 4 separate scarves that I own to kind of see what would happen. As I pulled them off this first one that is wool, I kind of separated a yarn back into the fibers, and it became very, very weak, right? So if they're unwound and pulled apart, they can be removed from the yarns, the fibers can. So on the wool, it became very fluffy. It was a protein fiber. The wool is a protein fiber. And pulling it apart, pulling the yarn apart, I'm kind of reversing the process to see what it was like. In the second screen, it's silk and cashmere, which are both protein, but it's a blend of silk and cashmere. and the silk allowed it to be spun very tightly, and it was a little bit hard to unwind. So I guess that this one is probably a 90-10, 90% silk and 10% cashmere, because I had a hard time getting the cashmere, the goat wool, to come off of it in reversing the process. In the third one, it's a linen, which is a cellulose fiber. It became weak and very disoriented when I unwound, when I untwisted it. It became super, super weak. The opposite process is when you're twisting all these fibers together, they become strong, but when you dissect them apart, they become weak. And the last one is cotton, another cellulose fiber, and also it became weak when I disassembled the wool and became fluffy, almost like a cotton plant. So it's kind of fun just to reverse the process on a few things out of my closet to see what happened. Next, we'll look at a video of polyester fibers. Consisted of fluid being extruded out of a spinneret, and that's duplicating, of course, of what a silkworm can do. That's how those monofilament fibers are made, and a polyester is a man-made fiber. So we got to watch how the cotton was made into a yarn. So I think next we're going to see how fibers. Okay, now we're going to talk about yarn ply that was mentioned in the first video, which are the number of fibers that are twisted together to make one yarn. So we have a single ply, we have a double ply, we have a triple ply, and I believe at the end of the last lecture, I hope I asked you to bring some yarn samples. I may or may not have done that. Let me make a note to add that to my slides, to bring yarn samples to class number 3. And I brought some yarn samples with me to show you ply. And so we have double ply, single ply, triple ply, and you can actually untwist this yarn to see how many ply it separates into. So in this image, I am showing you the same type of yarn that I'm holding right now. On the left of the image, you see that yarn. It comes off of this ball of yarn right here. It's a really nice 100% wool yarn. And then if I separate this into plies, just by untwisting it, I can see 4 definite plies here. Okay, now as it's the twisted piece of yarn that is 4 ply is strong enough that I can pull on it without damaging it too much. If I pulled on it really hard, I could probably break it. But when I separate it into the various 4 plies, 1, 2, 3, and 4, now I'm just holding one of those plies. And it's very, very weak. It's just made out of a bunch of fibers. And if I pull it, I could just easily break it. It just breaks so easily when it's gone back to just those fibers. Instead of being a 4 ply, which is twisted together, makes it substantially stronger. So a 4 ply is going to be strong, whereas breaking it down, it's just going to be very, very weak. So we're going to watch 2 brief videos about yarn twisting, just to show you a simple way that to some of your old 1 ply yarns, or even if you had a couple of 4 ply yarns that you wanted to twist together to make a more of a fancy look. We'll see that in just, actually, we're going to talk about Z and S twist first before we talk about the spinning those together. So we have 2 types of yarn. We have what's called an S twist and a Z twist, and you can see the S twist on the left, the Z twist on the right. And those 2 are important. They come into play when they want to twist different types of yarns together. The opposite twist helps different yarns twist together and hold their twist. We'll see that in a video about hair twisting in a few minutes. So an S twist is clockwise, a V twist is counterclockwise. I've got some yarn right here where if I take it apart, and if you can see it under magnification when I take it apart, well, I'll show you in the next slide. When I take apart these 2 yarns, one of them is an S twist and one of them is a Z twist, so that when they're put together, as they try to untwist, they twist around each other because they have opposite twist. So it's a little bit of a complicated concept to understand, but I'll say that again. So on this slide that you're looking at, we have a Z twist and an S twist that were put together. So they're going to naturally want to untwist until they're put together, and then they untwist and twist together. Does that make any sense? I hope so. So I have here a picture of several yarns, and if you can look at them very closely, can you determine if they're S twist or a Z twist? Draw an S on it or draw a Z on it and see what that center part of the letter of the alphabet, how it best matches. So the purple is an S. The one next to it, which is actually gray, is an S. I'm actually reading from the right side. So the white is an S, the gray is an S, the red is an S, the white next to it is an S, blue is an S, red is an S. Are you getting the impression that most yarns are S twists? And then when we get to that white, that's actually a Z. Right there, you can't see it very well, but that's actually a Z twist. The yellow is an S and the purple is an S. It's a little bit hard to see without looking at yarns up close to whether or not they're an S twist and a Z twist. But like I said, that just becomes important when you know the different properties of how they're twisted one way, the other one's twisted another way. When they're put together, they're going to easily twist together because of their opposite twist. Gives them kind of a moment. For fun, we can see the same thing that is made out of Legos. The same idea made out of Legos. We're big Lego fans in our family, so it was fun to find this. And it might not show. Let's try that again. Here we go. They're using a red thread, a blue thread, and a purple thread, winding 3 threads together on this one to get a 3-ply using 3 other yarns. Just combining them. And see how it makes kind of a tweedy looking yarn on the right? It's quite pretty what they've done by combining these 3 yarns into one 3-ply yarn. Oh, and I didn't see that. They're actually adding metallic thread there too. They have that gold metallic thread in the middle of the machine that is being added to it. Look how even that is. And how clever to make this out of Legos with a motor. There are a lot of clever people. Anyway, emphasizing the idea of twist, how different yarns get twisted together to make a thicker yarn, depending on what is needed. Now, this concept of twist again can be shown by this scarf that I pulled out of my closet. You see, it has a fringe of 2 groups of threads twisted together. And when I untwisted those 2 group of threads and show it to you under magnification in that center slide, hopefully you can see that one of those was a Z twist and one of those was an S twist. So when they're put together, they just kind of wrap around each other automatically, and then a yarn is then that newly twisted yarn is tied into a little knot on the bottom. Okay. So I guess I could ask, who cares about the way that the yarns are twisted? But it helps determine the characteristic of the fabric that is woven into, and we'll talk about that more next week as we talk about the fabric. So anyway, you saw that both of those 2 threads were wound in different directions, an S twist and a Z twist. That might make more sense. It's interesting that they're using a product that is, it's actually a very good product, and she said it's her mom's line. Anyway, so we've learned about twist, we learned about ply, and then we learned about twist. Let's talk a little bit about texture. Yarn can be texturized. Remember that goofy video that we watched in the first lesson, the first class on texture? A yarn can be texturized for bulk, if we want it to be very, very bulky, for carpeting and apparel. It can be texturized for stretch, for body fitting apparel such as hosiery, leotards, yoga pants. You need to have that stretch built into it. It can be texturized for a bulk and stretch combination, for textured wools, double knits, different applications. So it can be manipulated in a lot of ways depending on what you want the finished product to be like. Also, slubs and nubs can be added to yarns to give you a different texture in the fabric. In the one on the left, you see slubs where the yarn, you can see the yarn that is woven in there gradually shifts from thinner to thicker over long lengths, giving us what are called slubs. And in the nubs on the right, the yarn actually has a small knot that is fed into the fiber during spinning. So the slubs can either result from a natural random variations in the yarn width, or it can be mechanically controlled like it was in this one to add that characteristic. If you'll pull out your swatch book right now and look at swatch number 46, turn to 46. I'll give you just a minute to grab your swatch book. That's a beautiful Dupioni silk, and it has slubs in it. And you'll see in your notes under yarn type, it's a slub filling. So filling are the weft yarns that are added. The warp yarns are in place and the weft yarns are added. So in this one, a slub filling is added to give it this texture. And you can see in those yarns that run horizontally across that silk fabric that there are slubs built into it, giving us that classic look of Dupioni yarn. So slubs and nubs, I never can remember the difference between the two. They both give the yarn texture, and the nubs in the fabric that you see on the right have contrasting colors also that are dyed before the yarn is spun, which gives it that nice kind of heathered look with nubs in it. So I think that's the only sample that we have in our swatch kit that shows us what those slubs look like. We have novelty or special yarns here. I've just taken a picture of a chart that I made, so I guess you don't need to look at the one that I did because it's easier to see on the screen. So different spinning techniques yield different types of yarn, and these are what are called novelty yarns or specialty yarns. So the fabric on the left is what's called a boucle, where you get those wonderful loops. The one on the far left, that is a boucle yarn. It's a very common upholstery fabric that's made from boucle yarn. Also, you see women's jackets made out of this boucle. Chanel jackets often have a boucle yarn that they've been woven out of to give you kind of that loopy look. If you look at the threads or the yarns on the right, the red shows you a very exaggerated example of a slub built into the yarn. You see it's thin and then it's thick and then it's thin and then it's thick. The second one, the blue, shows the boucle yarn, is a yarn, the type of yarn that would have been used to weave the fabric on the far left that has all of those loops on it or curls. Gives you that classic boucle look. The white yarn that you see, the third one down, is also a loop yarn, but with smaller loops, so it would give you, just a smaller kind of a boucle look. And the red, same thing, has those loops built into it. The white one is a terry cloth, similar to a chenille. It's very, very fluffy. It has little teeny loops on it. That's called a terry cloth yarn. It's going to be made out of cotton. It's going to feel like terry cloth. The purple and the white on the bottom are called eyelash yarns. And when those are, I've knitted and crocheted with those, and it just gives you this very, very furry effect. All of those fibers just kind of stick out all over the place. It's like eyelashes. It's a very fun yarn to work with. So you have all these different textures that can be kind of built into the yarns that give you different kinds of products, different end products, just depending on how the yarn is fabricated and also depending on the types of fibers that the yarn was made out of. It can be manipulated in all kinds of ways to give us loops, slubs, nubs, eyelash fibers sticking out. All kinds of things can be done to manipulate the yarn. There is no one fiber that is superior to all others, but it's important to pick the fibers that are the best for the end use. Now, what you need to remember is you're not going to be choosing individual yarns for your clients, but looking ahead to next week's lecture, what will you be choosing with them? And no point in recording it on chat now because I won't be able to read it. But I want to hear your answer out loud, loud and clear. Say it out loud. What are you going to be choosing with your fabrics? Not the individual fibers, not the individual yarns, but you are going to be choosing fabric with them, okay? And that's what we're going to be discussing next week. Fabric structure, how those yarns that we've learned about today are actually woven or knit into fabrics or textiles. That will be our lecture. To watch a video on fabric structure, and you have to do your notebook assignment number 3, which you will find under description in your swatch book, but you're filling out fabric construction. Okay, I think I've emphasized that enough so that you will be able to find it. Again, if you have questions this week on this week's assignments, you can certainly text me, or it's better to email me on Canvas or Dashboard, whichever it's called. I forget. When I was in grad school, it was one or the other. Now it's the opposite, and I forget which is which. But you can always email me if you have questions. So good luck with the assignments this week. I hope you have enjoyed learning about yarns this week, and then we will get those yarns woven or knit into fabrics next week. So that's all for now. I look forward to your questions and look forward to grading your assignments. They take several hours to complete all 6 of them. Your course materials online show you can do it just out of plain computer paper. I find it's easier to use a thicker paper like a cardstock, and please use a couple of different colors so that you can see the contrast, so that you can see the weaving that you're taking place. And you'll find that some of us have better manual dexterity than others. So if weaving paper like this is hard for you, don't hesitate to ask somebody to help you do that. But like I said, it's not due for another 2 weeks, but you might want to get started on them because they can be a little bit complicated. So I'll see you next week for our class on fabric, on the structure of fabric. And like I said, you've got